Hey guys, Will here. So we're back again today with another shifter and handbrake review. Today we're going to be taking a detailed look at the Aiologs shifter out of Russia. So this is the first Russian product that I've ever reviewed on the channel, and also one of the most beautiful looking products that I've reviewed on the channel as well. These have that really beautiful sort of old school racing look to them. A lot of engineering and design elements have gone into this, both in terms of form and function. So they're definitely good to look at, which is always important. But let's take a closer look now and see what they're like to drive with. Okay, so here on the table in front of us, we have all the hardware that comes with both the handbrake and the shifter. I've only set out one set of the mounting hardware though, simply because it is exactly the same between both the shifter and the handbrake. So there's no need to go through both of them. We've also got only one USB cable here as well. Obviously, each of them has their own connection, as you can see on the back here. Now, one thing that you will notice if you've seen Barry from Sim Racing Garage's review that he did a couple of years ago now when his hair was a bit shorter than it is now, there are a couple of suggestions that he made in his review that have been implemented in the time since. So I would recommend go and watch his video as well as watching this one, and you'll be able to see the progression over time that they've made. So it's great to see that Aiologs are listening and that they are making improvements over time to what was already a really, really great product. So we will definitely go through the more significant changes in this video as well. But let's start off by going through all the bits of hardware that we have on the table here in front of us so you get a picture of exactly what's going on. And then we'll have a look at the quality, fit and finish, how it all goes together, and then go for a drive. So starting off over here, we've got the bag of bits and pieces. So we've got a couple of little rubber strips here which are used to protect your table should you be table mounting it. We've got the little metal cup and rubber foot that goes over it for our table clamp assembly. We'll look at that in just a moment. We've got two Allen keys to fit the various different cap screws that are used on the assemblies. Two longer screws as well for mounting, and I'll show you that in more detail in a moment. We've got a little screw in there as well for mounting this part to the table clamp. And having a look at this part now, this is the screw for the, I don't know, would you call that a screw? I don't even know, I guess it's a screw for the table clamp assemblies. But I mean, already you can see just how high quality all this stuff is, but even just this screw is, I mean, it looks like it might be acetal or Delrin or something like that. You can see, I don't know if the camera's really picking that up. There you go, you can see what looks like CNC machining marks there. I'm not sure 100%, I'm not an expert on plastics, but I mean, whatever it is, it's very high quality. We can tap it on the desk and it sounds extremely solid. So I really don't see any chance of that cracking regardless of how much pressure you put on there. But it just goes to show, even little bits and pieces like that, no expense has been spared, which is going to become abundantly clear as we progress through this review. So I might just grab that again quickly and I'll show you how this table clamp works. So we've got 5mm thick stainless steel for the table clamp, very solid. And you can actually see there again, the detail in how they finished this. So it looks like it is laser cut, and then they've gone and hand filed it afterwards. It just gives it that really nice industrial look to it. Yeah, that is absolutely beautiful. I have a soft spot for this kind of stuff, I'll admit. But so the table clamp basically works by screwing this through the bottom here. Screw goes through here. Gets screwed onto, you can see there's a little thread inside the main body there. So it's going to screw into that. And just in terms of attention to detail as well, I will point out that even with that screw screwed all the way down, there is still a little bit of side to side movement here available in the cup. So that means that if you've got it mounted on an uneven surface or something like that, it will screw up nice and tight and snug and not move around, even if you don't have a completely flat mounting surface. So that is normal. And yeah, every good, well-designed table clamp should have that feature. So we pop the rubber cap over that now. And then obviously this will screw down and mount to the table. So we grab one of these, you can see there's a little slot in the bottom. It slots in like so. And then you use your two additional bolts, one on either side, screws in like that. And then you screw that up. So if we wish to, we can also use those rubber strips, as we pointed out before. One on either side. And that is going to protect our table from any scratches or marks. Now, one other thing that I should point out as well before we move on is that the packaging was also very good. I didn't do an unboxing because it is quite plain packaging. It's just a brown box that you get, one with a S on it for shifter, another one exactly the same with an H on it for handbrake. So we had an ESD bag or anti-static bag to protect the electronics inside the handbrake and shifter, obviously both individually wrapped. And then we also had individually wrapped components. So each individual part had its own bubble wrap or little bag around it. So yeah, no chance of any damage or anything like that in transport unless, you know, a massive heavy box was dropped on top of it or something like that. So very well packaged. But anyway, let's continue on with having a look at the mounting hardware. So we also get this clever mounting bracket, and you'll notice that there are actually some additional holes that have been put in this since Barry's review as well. So this can be used in a variety of different ways. And again, I'll show you this in more detail once we get to actually mounting this on the rig. But if we have a quick look in the little book here, you can see we also do get some nice high quality stickers. I'm not really a sticker person, but as far as stickers go, those do look very nice. So let's put those aside as well. So the mounting bracket can be used on the left or right hand side vertically, horizontally as well. So if you want to mount it to one of your wheel uprights, which is actually what I ended up doing for my handbrake, you can do that as well. And you can also mount it on the base as well. So this is the handbrake or shifter flipped over like so, and then mount it on the bottom. You can also overlap two of these as well. So if you want to mount your shifter and handbrake side by side, you can do that. You basically would just mount them on top of each other. I'll show you that in a moment as well. And then if we flip over to the back here, you can see the table clamp assembly that we just looked at. Those are the two screws that we saw that go through the sides. And then we've got a 16mm long M10 thread for our shifter and handbrake arms. So should you wish to, you know, create your own arm or some sort of extension or something like that, you can screw it directly into the base with no issues whatsoever. So we'll set that aside as well. Set the mounting bracket aside. And let's have a closer look at the nuts and bolts of the more important stuff. So this is where we start to run into some of the updates since Barry's review a couple of years ago. So one of the things he called out was that there was no connection for the USB cable. So the cable just ran directly into the housing and into the circuit board internally. So we now have a USB-B connection on both of these. And the USB cable itself, it's a nice long 1.8 meter long cable as well. So you shouldn't have any issues running this back to your USB hub or back to your PC should you need to do so. Now, one of the other things that Barry mentioned as well is that there was no ferrite chokes on the original USB cable to deal with any sort of electromagnetic interference or EMI. You can see they've now added one of those to either side of the cable. So they've definitely been listening. Let's set that cable aside now as well and talk about the all-important knobs. So we've got billet aluminium in both cases, handbrake in my right hand, shifter in my left hand, but you could change those over should you wish to do so. And one significant change that you may have already picked up is that we now have grub screws rather than a thread. So threadless shaft here or threadless socket. And we have a look down inside there, you can see the grub screw, two grub screws, so it pinches in two directions, which is good. And this now bites onto the shaft. So both shafts are the same length now. Those are carbon steel, so they're nice and hefty as well. And we'll talk about the weight in just a moment too. We'll weigh these with everything connected. So you can see there on the carbon steel, there's a little machined notch, which is basically an indicator for the maximum height. So if we line that up with the bottom of the shifter, that is the point where the shaft is going through far enough to bite and engage with those grub screws. So if we put it there, that's our maximum height. But because we're no longer limited by a thread, what that means is that we can actually go all the way down as well for a much shorter throw. So if we screw that into the shifter, we now have a range, and it's going to be a bit of a crude measurement here that actually lines up pretty conveniently with the base. So if we go from the minimum to the maximum there, and line that up, it's about 5 centimeters or 50 millimeters, give or take a couple of millimeters. And if we do the same thing with the handbrake as well, so we'll screw that in. And remembering again as well that these are just a standard M10 thread. So you can always put your own shifter on there should you wish to do so, but let's have a look at this one too. So again, we'll line up the maximum. It's about a centimeter more than we had with the shifter. So give or take a millimeter or two, about 60 mils of variation there. So yeah, as I said, I was a little concerned that we might have some problems with those grub screws working their way loose over time, but I did use these for over 2 weeks. And in every case, I found that the thread would disengage if I turned anti-clockwise before I ever had an issue with those grub screws releasing. So yeah, definitely a very significant improvement there, at least in my opinion. But let's just quickly pull those back off again for now. And that'll give us a better opportunity to have a look at these very, very well designed and very, very beautiful modules in a bit more detail. And I should also mention as well, 12 millimeter diameter on those shafts. So if you want to add your own aftermarket knobs from your car or anything like that, you shouldn't have any problems doing that either. So let's get up close and personal with the shifter and handbrake assemblies themselves now. So obviously you can see the fundamental design between the two of them is very similar, and that is definitely not accidental. That's one of the reasons why the cost of these is so low compared to what you might expect for the quality. So minimizing the number of different parts that you have to manufacture obviously gives you more economy in terms of production. That is definitely one of the reasons why they're able to sell these so cheaply, but it still blows my mind just looking. I mean, you can see for yourselves, it's just mind-blowing that they're able to sell these so cheaply for what they are. So let's have a bit more of a detailed look here. So stainless steel construction throughout, with the exception of the billet aluminium little arm here that you can see actuating the potentiometer for the handbrake. And of course the plexiglass windows on the top as well. Now you might remember previously they had the Aiologs logo etched on the plexiglass. I wasn't a big fan of that design just from looking at photos and other reviews and things like that. So I much prefer the cleaner look that we have here now that really shows off the internal workings. But we do of course still have the Aiologs project logo on the front there. Loud and proud. But the way these are designed actually reminds me a little bit of my Husingvelt Ultimate pedals. You can see we've got these little notches cut away here around the outside, and that allows the whole assembly to sort of fit together rigidly, almost like a jigsaw puzzle. So you can see the front and rear plates all slot in. The plexiglass slots in as well here. These little plates on either side too, which hold that in place. And this is actually really clever as well because it stops you from accidentally catching the plexiglass and cracking it. So that's a really clever design. They really have thought of everything. And even the bottom plate here just screws in. You can see a couple more mounting holes as well there, which we'll have a look at in just a moment. So everything just kind of slots together, and then you've got these metal spaces internally as well to add a little bit more rigidity. And then all the various different componentry is all just sitting on standoffs. So you can see the huge spring in there. And in the case of the handbrake, we've got this little armature which comes off, goes on to the billet aluminium armature, and then that is what moves our potentiometer. If we have a look up close on the shifter, very similar design. We've got a couple of little switches here on either side, which are activated by this little arm here. So as the shifter moves one way, the arm flicks up, move it the other way, the arm flicks down and activates each of those contact switches. So let's just get up close on those now and I'll show you exactly how that mechanism works. We'll start off with the shifter and then we'll move on to the handbrake. So having a look at the shifter first, one of the things I really love about this design is we have a non-linear action. What I mean by that is the amount of force required changes throughout the stroke. So we've got the spring in there, obviously, which provides around about 2 kilograms of force, but then we also have these spring-loaded bearings as well. And if I do this quickly now, you can see as I pull it forward, we have to overcome the force fighting against us from those ball bearings as well as they push in. And there's little notches cut away in the armature here. So as you pull it back, it clicks into position. That not only provides that additional non-linear force that you can see in the graph here, but it also gives it that really nice click sound to it as well. And it really does sound absolutely fantastic. So let's just do that a couple more times. So it's kind of moving around on the table a little bit there as well. I'll give you a better picture of what this sounds like when it's mounted on the rig in just a moment. But going back the other way as well, you can see the notches work the other way. So very, very clever design, and I think they've done a really good job. Now, one thing that I will mention here is that the throw is quite short. Now, this is purely a subjective thing. Some people are going to prefer a longer throw, some people will prefer shorter. I mean, people pay good money to put short shift kits on their road cars in real life. So, you know, it really is a personal preference, subjective thing. I personally would prefer maybe a slightly longer throw, but you know, when you're driving, you kind of just get used to it. You set your muscle memory and it just becomes normal. Now, for me, I find that just under 3 kilogram amount of force required at the start and then down to 2 kilograms to be about spot on for my personal preference in terms of the resistance. But some people might find it's a little bit stiff. Some people might find it's not stiff enough. Again, it's going to depend on how strong you are and purely subjective. But one thing that I would have liked to have seen is an adjustment for the spring tension. Obviously, that would add a lot of other additional complexity to the design as well. So that would add additional cost. So I think that, you know, when you weigh it down to a cost versus reward benefit, I would prefer that they didn't include that functionality and it was cheaper rather than adding the functionality and making it more expensive. But let's have a closer look now at the handbrake. So as we mentioned before, the fundamental design between the spring mechanism on the shifter and the handbrake is the same. You can see there's a little arm in there, which basically just pulls back on the spring and winds it up as we pull the handbrake back. So this also has a non-linear response curve between about 2.5 kilograms of initial force to get it moving up to just under 4 kilograms as we reach full scale deflection. Now, there's also just inside there, I don't know if you can see on the camera, just down in there, a little piece of soft plastic. I'm not sure exactly what that material is. If we give it a little poke, Yeah, it seems to be some sort of a soft plastic, which acts sort of like a bump stop. So when you do reach the end of the stroke, it is quite a nice feeling. It's not like metal on metal contact or anything nasty like that. So again, they really have thought of everything. We also need to mention as well here that there are 2 modes available on this too. So we can have it in a analog mode, which is obviously what we're seeing here with the potentiometer turning as we pull the lever to give us a analog signal. But we can also press a little button on the back here, and that switches us into button mode, which is essentially like an on-off switch. So when you pull the handbrake, it activates. And we'll talk about this more when we go for a drive. We've just got that armature, which is obviously rotating the potentiometer to give us our analog signal. And it's as simple as that. So not a huge amount of deflection there. I'm not going to give you a measurement on it simply because it will vary depending on the height that you have the lever set to. But yeah, for me personally, just as a first impression, we'll comment on this again when we go for a drive, but I would like to see 2 things here. I'd like to see a little bit more throw, a little bit more action. If you compare that to something like the Akina handbrake that we reviewed a couple of days ago, that had a lot more throw in it and a much more non-linear sort of feeling in terms of the spring resistance as well. But yeah, we'll comment on this more in our driving test section. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, the mounting solutions are exactly the same between the shifter and the handbrake. So we're just going to use the shifter for this example. So we'll start off by having a look at the table clamp. We'll slot that in as we showed earlier on in the video. So it simply slots in. And there we go. So as I mentioned before, 3mm thick stainless steel for the housing and 5mm thick for these guys. And that is a genuine measurement as well. So just quickly put that on there. You can see 5mm and 3mm. Now, one interesting thing about this table clamp, and I think a really clever idea, is that you can also use this if you're mounting on aluminium profile. Now, there are other mounting solutions available for that as well, of course, but if you've got a piece of 40 by 40, it will actually slot nicely straight through the middle here. And if we wind that back out, slides through, and then clamps down in place like so. So if you have an aluminium extrusion rig with a 40 by 40 piece of profile, you can just mount it like that and Bob's your uncle. As far as mounting on a table though, the mount itself is far more hefty than any table that I have here in my house. And I did try on a few different tables and it was definitely wobbling the table around well before there was any flex in the assembly itself. So yeah, you're not gonna have any problems at all. But let's get this off now and have a look at the other mounting bracket. So back to this mounting bracket. Now, one of the things that I want to point out again is just the quality. And I know I keep going on about this, but I'm getting nerdgasms here. So you can see even just on the edge here, how they've beveled. They haven't just drilled holes through, which would have been perfectly adequate, but no, everything's got this nice sort of beveled or taper or whatever you want to call it. So I don't know whether it's lasered or machined somehow. I'm not sure exactly what the process is. Again, I'm not an expert on these sorts of things, but you know, just everything about this just screams quality. And again, I just can't believe that it's as cheap as it is. Just blows my mind. Anyway, so we've got 3 different mounting options here, as we mentioned before. So we can go vertically straight up and down to the side. So if you want to mount to your wheel deck, and then from the bottom as well. So let's have a look at all 3 solutions here. Now with the shifter, you can mount it facing either direction depending on how you want to orient or run your USB cable, simply because you can map the positive and negative shift to whichever button you want it to be inside your game. So it doesn't matter which way around you put it. With the handbrake, obviously you need to have it the correct direction because it only pulls in one direction. So the mounting bracket can go like this, lining up with the holes like that. It can go like that, or flipping it over, we can go like this, or obviously if we flip it around the other way, like that. So that gives us the option of mounting on either side of our profile. So you can imagine our profiles like this, mounted like that. We can go this side, we can go this side in either direction. Now, if we want to mount our shifter and our handbrake side by side, what we would do is just overlap the 2. So we bolt them like this together. Handbrake would go on one side and shifter would go on the other. Or if you want to go from the underneath, you could do that as well. So you could go like that, one on one side, one on the other side. You get the idea. So there's plenty of adjustment there. But let's go ahead now and I'll show you how I actually had it mounted on my rig in the end.
So I tested out a bunch of different configurations in terms of placement. This is where I found I was most comfortable for the style of driving that I do. So, you know, I don't do a whole lot of driving with a handbrake, so I didn't want to sort of have it be in the way of the shifter at all. But, you know, when I'm doing rally style driving or anything like that, I like to have the handbrake as close as I possibly can to the steering wheel, so it's a really quick sort of reach across to grab it. So this is what I ended up with, and as you can see, very little movement whatsoever in those mounts. In fact, there's no discernible movement whatsoever when driving between the shifter and handbrake and the rig itself. As you can see here, there is a little bit of movement. That's actually the rig moving around on the caster wheels itself, sort of swiveling, rather than the shifter and handbrake moving around on the rig itself. Now, another thing that we need to highlight now that we're all plugged in is the red lights that illuminate on the PCBs in both of these as well. And it gives it that really nice sort of red glow when you're driving. It's not obnoxious, it's not too bright that it's kind of distracting when you're driving or anything like that. There isn't a way to switch this off by pressing a button or anything like that, so you are stuck with it if you don't like it. But it is a really easy way to tell at a glance whether your shifter and handbrake are plugged in. So let's move on now to the driving experience. We'll talk about the handbrake first. So admittedly, I don't have a whole bunch of experience driving with a handbrake. It's just not something that I do all that frequently. So you will see me struggling a little bit in the game footage. That's partly just down to my lack of experience, as well as, you know, finding this handbrake a little bit more difficult to get accustomed to than I did with the Akina handbrake that I tested a few days ago. What I found is with that additional throw of the Akina handbrake, I was able to modulate my braking and the amount of lockup in the rear wheels a little bit more easily from the start than I could with this one. But what I did find is after an hour or two of driving with this handbrake, I was able to, you know, pretty much match my performance that I had previously, and, you know, I was actually doing better lap times by the end of it just because my experience with using a handbrake was increasing. So what I would say is that while the handbrake does feel really nice, I definitely would like to have a little bit more adjustability in terms of the spring tension and have a little bit more non-linearity in terms of how it responds as well, just so you can get a slightly better feeling of exactly where the threshold is and kind of modulate it a little bit better. So a little bit of an increase in throw would help with that as well. But overall, a very good experience with the handbrake. I'm certainly not speaking badly of it. I absolutely love it. And once I had adapted to it, I was absolutely fine. It just took me a little bit longer to establish that muscle memory off the bat. So if they were to release an upgraded model into the future, I'd like to see probably maybe 50% more throw on it. And again, this is a subjective thing as well. Some people will prefer the shorter throw, but for me, I prefer a longer throw in the handbrake just because it gives you a little bit more ability to modulate. And you guys would have heard me talk about this when I was speaking about my upgrade to the Hurricane Ultimate pedals over my V3 pedals as well. The V3 pedals with the performance kit have a very short throw, and I just find it more difficult, even with a load cell system, to modulate my braking inputs with a shorter throw. So it might just be me, and it is a personal preference thing, but that is, you know, my opinion for what it's worth. Now, one thing that I did notice that happened a couple of times, you might have already picked this up in the footage, is the thread in the base of the handbrake and the shifter, so that M10 thread that we looked at earlier worked its way loose over time, and you can see the handbrake here in particular sort of rattling around a little bit as I'm driving. So I did a little bit of testing around this, and I found it was only happening when I was driving with gloves that had a rubber grip on them. So what I found is that every time I was grabbing the handbrake or the shifter, I was inadvertently rotating it just a little bit and slightly undoing that thread to the point where it was becoming loose. Now, because I've got my shifter and my handbrake on the left-hand side, because I'm in Australia where that's where we have them in real life, it's a problem because you're always twisting in an anti-clockwise direction. I'd imagine if you had the handbrake and shifter mounted on the right-hand side, this wouldn't be a problem, is because you'd be sort of tightening it as you go. What I ended up doing was putting just a touch of Loctite thread locker on the thread, and in the 2 weeks of driving that I did after that, didn't have any issues again whatsoever. So now onto the shifter. I absolutely fell in love with the shifter. Now it's funny because although it maybe doesn't feel quite as realistic as the FANATEC shifter that I'm used to in terms of the mechanical feel of actually, you know, mechanically moving a gear into position, it just has such a nice positive click to it that I actually found that I preferred the feeling of it, even though it perhaps isn't quite as realistic. Now, some people might disagree with me. Some people might say that it feels more realistic. I do have a little bit of experience driving real cars with sequential shifters though. But yeah, I found that, you know, just the precision in this shifter, the positive feel, the beautiful sort of click as you pull it, and the really nice feeling bump stop at the end of the throw as well. Yeah, just there really isn't anything to dislike about this shifter. I did find that for me, having the shift knob adjusted to the top of the shaft gave me the right amount of throw. Anything less than that, and I felt that it was a little bit short, but again, having that adjustability is great because it means that you can fine tune it to your personal preference. But yeah, the experience with this shifter is something that I really couldn't find any faults with whatsoever. It was reliable, it felt the same, you know, after 2 weeks of usage and heavy usage as well. I used this quite a lot. It didn't adapt or change in its feeling whatsoever, and I can't see any reason why it would change over time. I didn't see any build-up of residue or anything like that inside that would indicate any form of wear and tear. And there really aren't any parts inside that wouldn't experience any wear and tear because everything's that stainless steel material that we looked at before. So yeah, I can't find anything to dislike about this shifter. Absolutely love it. Now, just before we move on into the final thoughts, I'll let you have a little bit of a listen to the operation. Now, remember that we do have a lot of other things going on here as well. We've got seat belts clacking around. We've got the motion platform moving around as well. But listen in particular to the fact that the handbrake doesn't make any sound whatsoever when functioning, and just the nice sound of the shifter as well. I feel like the volume level with the click on this is just enough that you can hear it, so you know that you've made a shift, but not so loud that it's sort of overpowering or sort of takes away from the immersion of the game. So have a little listen now, and then we'll move on into our final thoughts.
6 left, into 4 right long, into 3 left long, tightens dot cut.
Okay guys, so I've been scratching my mind for the better part of the last week trying to figure out how to best convey my final thoughts on the Aiologs shifter and handbrake, and I think I'm probably up to about my 50th take on this as well, but I really want to sort of convey the emotional response, I guess, that I've had to this. And that sounds a little bit weird, but one of the things that happens when you're reviewing high-end gear all the time, like we do on Boosted Meeting, we're very lucky to be in the position that we do get to experience some really, really nice gear on a very regular basis. But one of the things that does happen is you do become desensitized over time. And the same thing happened as well back when I used to work at Sony. I remember, you know, I think back to when I first started working there and how excited I used to get with a new product coming across my desk. And then by the time I was finishing up there, you know, I just didn't get excited about things anymore. But this has kind of been a bit of a reset for me, because when I look at the product, and even though there are some things that I'll talk about in just a moment that I perhaps don't like about these as much as I do about the Akina and Pikes, as well as the FANATEC gear, you know, I just can't get past the overall quality and fit and finish of this product. I look at it and I can just imagine somebody handcrafting it and being proud of the finished product. And that speaks volumes to me. Even though the handbrake doesn't have the same level of adjustability as the Akina handbrake does that we reviewed just a couple of days ago, and even though the shifter doesn't have an H pattern mode like the FANATEC one does, you know, those are both reasons why I would perhaps prefer to have the Akina handbrake and the FANATEC shifter on my rig. I just can't go past these ones. These are the ones that I always end up putting back on my rig when I just feel like going for a drive at the end of a day's work. So particularly when you consider the price point as well, it's just really, really hard to go past these. They have such a precise feel in them. There's absolutely no play in either of them whatsoever when they're just sitting there. There's no movement at all. The only little bit of movement that you can see there is just wiggling around on my slightly uneven table. But yeah, they just feel so tight and so precise. But I mean, it's just so smooth. It feels almost hydraulic. You know, when products like this come across the table, it really does sort of reset me and make me remember again why I love doing this job. And, you know, just what is possible to achieve, you know, at a given price point. Again, like what Barry said in his review of these, you know, when you have a price point in mind, you kind of adjust your expectation based on what you expect for that price point. But yeah, I think that these are something that go a little bit beyond just the driving experience. There's something that you're definitely going to appreciate and admire every single time you jump into your rig. So definitely worth the money, no question about that whatsoever. In terms of whether they're better or worse than other products in the range, I think it purely does come down to the subjective nature of how we interact with these sorts of things. It would be nice to see a little bit more adjustability, but yeah, overall, I just can't fault these whatsoever. So big thumbs up from me. Speaking of thumbs up, please do leave a thumbs up on the video if you've enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing and hit the notification bell too if you haven't already. And yeah, I'm gonna get back into doing some driving, so I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.